As women around the world strive to create their professional identities, it's not uncommon for Latinas, Black, Asian, women of color to feel like they have to make others feel comfortable when they're in a group, especially if that group is made up of people who look nothing like them. In today's episode, author, designer, dancer, and fellow creative Dr. Natalie Nixon and I dive deep into the intersection of the creativity leap, improvisation, and finding acceptance in worlds that may not welcome you. As the great Maya Angelou once said, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Natalie, where does your story begin?
So I am from Philly. I'm from Philadelphia on the East Coast of the United States. And I grew up in a community called Mount Airy. I grew up actually in East Mount Airy. And if you're from Philly, then especially if you're from the Northwest section of Philly, you understand that distinction. In a lot of ways, Mount Airy is a prime example of redlining that started happening in the 50s and 60s. So I grew up in East Mount Airy, which is a bit more proletariat. I grew up on a block that was full of cops and nurses, and grew up playing double dutch and hopscotch and tag and asking our mom permission to go to the corner store. My parents owned a two-story duplex twin, which meant that this was two-bedroom apartments, and they always rented out the first floor apartment. And we being my parents, my sister and me, we lived on the second floor. And I recently had the honor to be interviewed and featured in a Fast Company column written by Doreen Lorenzo, who writes a column called Designing Women. And it was in reflecting on the small space in which I grew up in, that I realized that was probably my first introduction to design, because my mother is just, first of all, she's an artist, she's a weaver, and the way she designed space so that our family in our childhood, we had kind of zones for play, for reading time, for study, for rest, etc., was pretty phenomenal. Because when I go back home sometimes, because my mom's still there. My dad sadly passed away in 2012. It's now her music room, but I marvel at the way we made a life there, because it looks so small now. So that's where I grew up, and I actually was educated in three very different types of learning environments. Maybe I should say four different types, because I started out in kind of a crunchy granola cooperative nursery school. I then went to Philly Urban Public School from kindergarten through third grade. I then went to a suburban public school just outside of Philly from fourth through sixth grade. And then grades 7 through 12, I went to a fantastic and elitist Quaker prep school. And I reference that because those very distinctive types of cultures of learning were incredibly impactful on the ways I have evolved and the way I developed, and equipped me with what I call the ability to be a boundary spanner. And so what I mean by that is urban public school, which was a predominantly African-American school, public schools to this day remain some of the most segregated institutions in our country. And in a school that was 98% Black, there was already tracking starting to happen. And my mom was vociferous and advocating for us. And she got me into, I remember a section that I would be pulled out of class, was more advanced work. And in this section, I'm like a second grader, and I would notice like I was the only little Black girl in the class. And she would ask me, how are you enjoying that class? And I'd say, I don't really like it. And she'd say, well, why don't you like it? And I'd say, because my friends aren't there. And she'd say, that's why you're there. My parents got so fed up with having to teach me my multiplication tables, how to tell time. my father figured out that if we went to a public school in a neighboring suburb, he'd have to pay the county money because we, our taxes weren't going there. We lived in Philly, but we would be able to attend that school. So that's why we started going to the suburban public school. However, I was called the N word every other day for the first couple of weeks of school. This was a school that was predominantly white. It was blue collar, Polish, Irish, Italian American. And it was, to say the least, a culture shock for me. And it was also the beginning of me learning how to advocate for myself, to be comfortable many times of being alone, but also becoming really agile about being curious about people who are different from me, and forging friendships. And by the way, those same boys were buddies by the end of the school year because they were repeating what they heard at home. And I was really good at sports, and play is a way that kids connect. That was also a chapter of my life where I felt intensely my father's love, because he would just show up at the school in random moments. I'd see him down the hall talking to the school principal. He'd just appear in the doorway of the classroom. And that is that knowing that your parents have you, are holding you, are there for you, it was priceless. So then I go to this private school, 7th through 12th grade. And while I was an A student, I land at this school where I had gotten so good at giving the teachers what they wanted. I was great at completing the worksheets, filling in the dots. And then I arrived at a school where it was all about ask a better question. It was all about asking for forgiveness, not permission. And my grades plummeted in 7th and 8th grade, in part because I had to navigate, you know, being on a campus, not just in a classroom. I was playing things like field hockey, but taking the public transportation every day to school and navigating my Black neighborhood, walking home with this field hockey stick. Where we didn't play field hockey where I grew up. So there are all sorts of shifts like that equipped me with what I call this capacity for boundary spanning. And so that's how I grew up, in an incredibly loving environment. My home was full of art, music. I studied dance since age 4. I was a modern dancer. My mom loved classical music, European classical music, because she actually trained to be an opera singer when she was in high school. And my dad was a big jazz head. So our home was full of music, classical jazz, R&B. And yeah, I had an incredible childhood.
Boundary spanning seems like a form of transcendence. You're transcending people's expectations, societal racism, and the times in which you live, those mental models. Can you share how your love of learning helped you traverse and transcend the complexity of feeling like an outsider in pursuit of acceptance?
I always landed on my feet, even though it might have been a bit of a clumsy land at certain moments. But in the second phase, when I was at the suburban public school, absolutely, I made friends. I figured out how to fit in. I excelled in my schoolwork, in my academics. I've always been a nerd. I was a bookworm growing up. My idea of happiness on a rainy afternoon was just to read all day. I was a big Nancy Drew fan, and I subscribed to Highlights magazine. And then I went through a spell in middle school where even before mysteries, I was really into fairy tales as a little girl. Then I got into mysteries, and then I was really into the Victorian classics and the Brontes and those authors up through junior high school. And and just to kind of give you a sense of what a geek I was, I subscribed to The Atlantic in high school in 10th grade. I love the essays.
I love
They
it.
were in The Atlantic. So anyway, what I loved about the prep school where I attended was it was cool to be smart. It was cool to be a nerd. What I really struggled with was one of the things that we forget is that race is a social construct. And you've kind of indicated that in part of what you asked me just now, Joanna, is a social
Yeah.
construct. And one of the things I became very aware of in going from the suburban public school to this prep school was what were class differences among white people, class differences among Black people, and how race and ethnicity can also be often be a veil for that. So while my academics plummeted initially because there was so much I was trying to navigate, plus combine that with being 13 is hard. It sucks.
Yeah.
It's pimples.
Yeah.
I'm not pretty. I can't talk to boys. I look better in a leotard than in real clothes because I was so skinny. It was all that going on as well. So what the acceptance for me came a lot, this is part of being in high school, part of being a teenager, was slowly but surely, incrementally accepting myself. I always called the group of friends I had, we were kind of the floater girls. We were smart, we were athletic, we weren't popular, we weren't cool, we didn't date, but we got along with everybody. And that was kind of my crew. And that environment gave me it really was the foundation of my intellectual confidence, right? I mean, college, I was prepared. It was definitely a prep school. I was prepared for college. It was like a book a week. What else you got? Like I've been through all that. So the acceptance it was just differently nuanced as I got older and as I was in this predominantly white prep school environment where, I had friends who lived in homes where they had basically their own wing of a home. Spring break for us was, okay, you can help me around the house more. You got to clean the woodwork and the banisters. And they went to Vail, So it was really about being okay with my differences on so many dimensions and also connecting with others on stuff we like to read, on stuff that we dreamt about, on um, things that we were really talented in. So I really want to go back to that phrase I've coined called boundary spanning because it what it's not like I thought of myself in that way in those moments. It wasn't until my early 30s that I realized what an asset it had been for me to be often on the margins as an outsider. Because in my 20s, quite frankly, I had my hands on my hips a lot. I was tired of being the only one of a few. You can count on one hand the number of people of color or number of Black women or Black people, whatever, whatever the matrix is, the metric is. But I had the opportunity to live and work abroad in my late 20s. I was living in Sri Lanka and I lived in Portugal later. I was working in the fashion industry and living in Sri Lanka, traveling throughout Asia. I was exposed to some really incredibly badass Asian women who were executives at this firm where I worked. And I was much, much, much junior to them, but I was privy to sitting in meetings where I would observe them unabashedly lead with their femininity, with their ethnicity, and they converted Western, typically white American men who were fellow executives, from, coming over from the States to, checking out factories, deciding if they're going to place orders. I would observe the ways that they converted people's assumptions about them, and they would have these visitors wrapped around their finger by the end of a meeting where I knew what we were trying to negotiate. I knew where we were trying to land. And I would just observe really brilliantly subversive behaviors. And I started thinking to myself, there's something familiar about this for me as a Black American woman. And so by the time I was in my early 30s, being exposed to these really brilliant, professionally savvy women, I realized all of those years where I was the only one, had to be more curious, cultivate my my skills of observation. My EQ was off the charts. I am incredibly politically savvy because I have to be, because when I walk in the room, I have to summarize and identify power dynamics within the first 60 seconds. I often quip with, especially with Black American friends, and my husband and I talk about this all the time, that one of the things about being Black in America is that you get really excellent at making other people comfortable. And that's actually an asset. So when I talk about boundary spanning, it's about converting all of those attributes that used to be a pain in the behind. I realized this has given me incredible perspective. These are really assets that I can leverage, and I continue to leverage to this day.
Natalie, we have so many things in common. You're right that race is a social construct, but it's one that is so complex. I really identified with what you said because as a kid, I felt pigmentally challenged. For my Hispanic friends, I had to navigate not being Hispanic enough because of the color of my skin. And among my Caucasian friends or non-Latino friends, I didn't dare speak Spanish for fear of rejection because Latinas are taught to truly be considered as the American ideal, we needed to speak English. Where I felt such a link to your term boundary spanning was in the context of my lived experience as a Latino and as yours as a Black woman. In order for us to gain acceptance of our ideas, whether it's personally or professionally, we must always begin with making other people comfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, even though I might be, pick a room, whatever room we're in, I might be outnumbered gender wise or ethnicity wise. Somehow, I'm still glanced at. I'm still looked at a little longer. As women, we all go through those scenarios where, we offered up the idea, 3 meetings earlier, and all of a sudden it becomes someone else's idea. All of those sorts of things, and you have to navigate being confident without being accused of being a bitch. You have to be smart without being accused of being arrogant. I was a professor for 16 years. And so to be a smart, confident woman is not coded in the same way, especially if you're a smart, confident woman of color. It's coded very differently than if you are a smart, confident man. And I negotiated that in terms of student evaluations. I negotiated that in terms of peer reviews. It's a very different standard that you're constantly navigating. And I grew up in a home where education was incredibly valued by my entire family. That's why my parents sacrificed so much for us to be educated in the best environments possible. And I grew up hearing, you can't afford to mess up. If you mess up, you'll be noticed. I mean, I heard this in middle school, right? So, and it was usually coming from my dad, because my dad didn't mince words. He didn't mince words about how hard he was working and the financial sacrifices they were making to send us to, as he put it, that school. Right. And I got it, and my mom was the shoulder I could cry on, but my dad was like, look, this is the deal. And this is, and he was unapologetic about it, because and a lot of times when I reflect on my father, I think about how, and in so many ways, he was really old school. He was the provider, but chauvinistic. And he was the man who taught me, in his words, the right way to wash a car, how to mow the grass. He was the one who, he had like 2 side hustles in addition to his main job in order to get us through prep school. And he also, I constantly heard messages of, girls, you got to have your own. You must have your own. And he went in terms of ownership of real estate.
Right.
I always heard those messages from my father. So, being able to sift and sort through all of that messaging is coming from one's parents, it's coming from the signals you're getting from classmates, from colleagues. Yeah, still in 2021, this is a reality of needing to, in my words, make others comfortable with me, but not, I no longer resent it. I now realize it's an incredible asset. It actually gives me a leg up in my ability to discern, in my ability to communicate, in my ability to strategize. These are incredible assets.
STEAM skills equip women and girls to participate in the global workforce. Yet in 2021, only 27% of scientists, technologists, engineers, artists, mathematicians, and designers were women. This is why DesignByUs.org is committed to closing the gender and pay gap, enabling 10 million women and girls to take command of the command line and change the world for good. Last year, your donations helped the Design Corps fight climate change, COVID-19, and disinformation on the web. Your donations and investment help us meet this goal. I'm asking you to visit designbyyus.org/donate. That's DESIGNED.BYUS.org/DONATE and make a donation today.
Back again with Natalie Nixon, the author of The Creativity Leap, which you can get today on Amazon.com. What is the formula for making people comfortable?
It is about deep and active listening. It is about acknowledgement of what you've heard from them. And it's about incredibly savvy, strategically pointed remarks about how you let yourself shine, how you unapologetically own your ideas and speak up for yourself, and don't dumb yourself down. But it has to be done very strategically, because and you don't know this out the gate how to do this, but you hit some walls, you get your hands slapped, you learned from others, and that's another part of it. This is not a solo game. You've got to have a community through your family or through your creative family or through friendships of people who get it. Otherwise you'll be exhausted. John, my husband, who is an attorney, he's a partner at a major law firm. We often talk about something, we were calling it the black tax, until we learned that there's actually people who study the neuroscience of the brain. There's something to what we were calling the black tax. And the black tax is as follows. When I was a professor, if someone said to me, a student, a colleague said something to me a bit sideways that it gave me pause, in milliseconds, I had to decide, should I respond to that person right now? Is that person having a bad day? Did that person mean to be offensive or condescending? And sorry, this is another way I would think about it. Did that person just say that to me in that manner because A, I'm a woman, B, I'm Black, C, I'm a Black woman, or D, they're just having a bad day? but I have to decide that in milliseconds. Now, how that translates physiologically is that every time we are triggered like that, that is sparking the fight flight response in the hypothalamus at the base of the brain. And every time the fight flight response it gets triggered, that causes our body, for great reasons, to release the stress hormones. But over time, that builds up in our livers. Over time, that builds up and causes strained heart conditions, which is why the research shows that across socioeconomic classes for African Americans, we have a disproportionate amount of heart disease. We have a disproportionate amount of high blood pressure. Whether you're talking about Mr. Ken Chenault, former CEO of American Express, or you're talking about the brother on the corner, there is an inordinate amount of constantly going through that. So being able to first abstractly and rationally say, okay, this is what's happening in my body. B, do I want that to continue to happen in my body? Right? You have to get really strategic about what you absorb and what you deflect.
So one of the things that you touched on that really got me so excited on was both your mother's creativity, your father's love for jazz. In those early years, it seemed like those were things that were absolutely infused into a part of your life. I don't know about you, but for me, I can actually, like, there's a song that triggers a moment where I remember with my father, or there's a song that triggers, learning to dance, which, by the way, Natalie, I'm a terrible dancer. I'm going to definitely need some lessons.
Yes, take lessons.
Should we ever get to dance together?
Yeah, take lessons.
But because my mother's a fantastic dancer, so she was always teaching us, some kind of form of new creativity. We have that in common. Do you find those bits and those pieces have fed your existence today in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, just to clarify, are you asking me for some examples of those? Oh, okay, great. So, when it comes to my dad, since you referenced music, there is a song by the R&B group LTD, and Jeffrey Osborne used to be the lead singer for LTD. And I'm gonna mess up the title of the song, but one of the main lyrics in the chorus is, and what we have is much more than they can see. And I just remember my father blasting that album, Earth, Wind, and Fire, when he'd be cleaning up around the house and doing other things around the house on weekends. Also, any Horace Silver composition, any John Coltrane, Miles Davis, always reminds me of my father. And by the time, actually, when we were pretty small, not even middle school yet, my father would take us along to outdoor jazz concerts. And I've shared in other keynotes and talks I've given how I knew from a very young age that my father was in what we would now call a state of flow. He was in his zone. He was happy. He was content when he was listening to, as he called it, his music. And so I know that was one of the reasons that I really urged myself to try to get into jazz, because jazz is not a young person's genre of music. Like, jazz is kind of complicated. It's like it's a very sophisticated genre of music. And so like more of the vocal standards was something I could easily get into, because my father loved Frank Sinatra. And the reason he loved Frank Sinatra is because Count Basie's band backed up Frank Sinatra.
Right. Yeah.
So I know the entire Frank Sinatra catalog. I know Ella Fitzgerald, Dinah Washington, Billie Holiday, because of that. And so the lyrical vocals of jazz is something that's a little bit more accessible, but getting into the cool period and then bebop and all that was something I grew into. And really, Because I knew it was a way for me to access my dad. It was a way for me to snuggle up next to him and be in his spaces with him. For my mom, it's classical music, and it's Bach, it's Beethoven, it's the Baroque period of European classical music. You know, when I left home for college, um, sophomore year, my mom turned 50, and she announced that she was now going to learn to play the cello. And I thought, what? What's she talking about? And she did. And to this day, she's now 81 years old, and she still plays the cello. And when you think about like what an audacious instrument to start with, like it doesn't have frets, you can't really
Right.
see like where your hand positioning should be, but she loves the cello. She loves the sound of it. And she's been in a couple of community orchestras. She's had this, she's gone through about maybe just two teachers that I really recall, and one teacher she still studies with. But I think that's phenomenal. Like my mother is one of my what I call my rigor mentors, just because of her openness to commit to the discipline and the humility it takes to be a student of something. So those would be a few examples.
Oh, that's fantastic. Fantastic. So as we kind of dive into, kind of connecting that past to where you are today, um, tell me a little bit about some of the problem spaces that you are in and that you are solving for.
The biggest one is really, I would call it in that area of the future of work. And my perspective on the future of work is, okay, folks, the train has left the station. We're in the fourth industrial revolution. Tech is ubiquitous. So let's get on with the work and the business of making space for the human to be more prominent. And my work is really at the intersection of technology, productivity, and meaningful human experience. In my view, the organizations and leaders who will flourish will be the ones that can can navigate and have a balancing act between tech, productivity, and meaningful human experience and connection. And I'm biased, but I believe that creativity is the through line for all of that. So a lot of the struggles I see are really around shifting the way we've been thinking about work. And the pandemic and the quarantine was a blessing and a curse. It was a curse because there was so much loss on a lot of different levels. People died, people lost work, people lost clients, but there's also huge opportunities. A lot of people had, and organizations had these existential moments about what matters. What do we really want to focus on? What are we actually good at? How do we want to show up in our services to people? And so the problems I'm really helping people to solve are to integrate creativity in a very meaningful and intentional way. Thank you for reading my book, Joanna, The Creativity Leap, so you're aware that the way I think about creativity and define it is that it's about toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Because I really wanted to land on a definition that would be accessible, that would be simple, so that more people would stop conflating creativity only with artists or only with designers, because that's not actually fair to artists or designers, right?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And I love that you touched on the wonder and the rigor. It's actually something that I have experienced. And when I went to, it's interesting because within the world of design, and I have shared this with so many people, is that what the pandemic exposed, right, is that while creativity is important, the demand for the rigor piece of this is, right, not just how we show up, but are we disenfranchising communities by the product that we're creating? Like stopping for a moment and not just daring, but demanding to ask those questions. Is the product I'm creating representative of a global population?
Right.
Right. Without some kind of economic devastation or
Right.
environmental impact.
And that, you just, I was going to say that starts with asking new and different questions, which you just demonstrated. You asked a question, right? But
Right.
we have to ask those questions. And so then so how do you ask those questions? And so I've been working on this model to just kind of visualize for people. It's a visual model, it's a framework to visualize for people why I say that before you can empathize with anyone, you have to first be curious. You have to have the ability to frame a question of, why do they do it that way, not our way? How come? Why do they sit over there, not over here? Why? Like, if you never even pause to ask the question, you really can't empathize. But then I started thinking, well, what's the precursor to curiosity? I think the precursor to curiosity is humility. So now my visual framing is like, at the core is humility. That then leads to curiosity, which folds into empathy. Empathy hopefully lands us in action, right? You can't just empathize, but you got to act and behave differently. And then finally, ideally, that leads to equity. So there is a bold, solid line that we can connect all the way back from humility to curiosity, empathy, action, and then equity. And it all starts with asking new and different questions, which means we've got to have a really super diverse group of people around the table, diverse in terms of backgrounds, skills, ethnicity, gender, age, orientation, all of those things, because I cannot possibly think of the questions that you would think of, Joanna. You have different skills, different set of experiences, a different lens, and that's a good thing. There's an expression I like to use, I thought of, which is that the more diverse the inputs, the more innovative the output.
One of the things that I love about your book, The Creativity Leap, which, by the way, can be ordered today at Amazon.com, is the topic around transforming the meaning of soft skills into hard skills. And let's go into that a little bit. Soft skills, you start by really reflecting on how soft skills often are hard to measure. But by reframing them into hard skills, you're able to connect them to monetary value.
I'm happy to hear that. That's great news. I'm glad that you walked away with that insight. That's awesome.
What was the provocation for the book?
There were a couple. One was that I wanted to come up with an accessible, simple way to democratize creativity. And that was because in my consulting practice, where I would often be invited in to help clients build cultures of innovation, everyone's throwing around the I word. I had this feeling like we're missing, we're kind of talking over and around each other. And I had this sense that we're starting at the wrong place. But, you can't critique a situation without offering up an alternative way of thinking about it. And that's the part I didn't have yet. And I, so this was over a period of about 3 or 4 years where inch by inch, I was like, I think we really should be starting with creativity. The problem with that, obviously, is that in most corporate environments, I can't lead with creativity because people don't really understand creativity. They only conflate creativity with song, music, dance, art, painting, sculpture, right? And so they'll think, well, what the heck is she talking about? That's not what we do here. We do the important stuff, right? We don't do that stuff, right? So one reason for writing the book was to really unpack through my own research and experiences, what are we really talking about when we're talking about creativity? I believe we're talking about toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value. And then how does creativity become the engine for innovation? So that was one reason to write the book. The other reason was a very practical reason. I'm a global keynote speaker. I really use my speaking in a lot of ways to prototype ideas. And so every time I was being invited to speak for clients, I would interweave into some of my talks these new ways of framing these ideas about creativity, and you get immediate feedback when you speak. And so when people come up to me after my keynotes and say, "Oh, that was really awesome. Where can I learn more about this?" I blogged for Inc., but I didn't have one repository where people could go to really learn more about what I was talking about. And so quite frankly, the other reason I wrote the book was to productize my intellectual capital and to have a one place where people could do deeper dive into what I was talking about, have exercises, have prompts and questions. So those were the two major reasons why I wrote the book.
Those are great reasons. I think the thing that I took away also in the book, and a little bit of those provocations, is insight, intuition, and improvisation as a framework.
Well, actually, that's an example of an early prototype because that was an early version. And so where I landed actually is what I call the 3 I's, which are inquiry, improvisation, and intuition, which when interwoven lead to insight. So you probably saw an earlier diagram when I was playing around with the idea.
Sure, absolutely. But I think that's kind of the beauty of it. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like to write your first. Let me start with, was this your first book?
This was the first book I solely authored. I have edited a book called Strategic Design Thinking, Innovation in Products, Services, Experiences, and Beyond. And I that book is a book that I wrote after I completed my PhD. And that matters because as a professor, I used to, I would be requested to review textbooks. And so the editor I got to know over a long period of time at Fairchild Books, which is now Bloomsbury Publishers, when she learned that I decided to earn a PhD while working full-time in my field as service design management, she said, "Oh, that's so cool. When you're done, let's talk about you writing a book." So I finished my PhD in 4 years while working full time. We're still in contact. And she says, "Well, how about that book?" And I said, "Gosh, I just don't have the bandwidth." I'm now working on launching a new strategic design MBA program for the university. I just don't have the bandwidth. And she said, "Are you?" I said, "How about if I edit the book?" And she said, "Are you sure? I think you'll find editing a little more challenging than sole authorship." I say, no, I'm going to edit the book. And in her wisdom, she was probably right, because editing a book is like herding feral cats. So, it's a great book. I'm proud of it because it's a nice blend of contributors who are both scholars and practitioners, which is what I want. I'm very hybrid in my approaches. So that was the first book that I got out, and I wrote the chapter on service design. And then this book was it was both hard and liberating. There's a reason that not everyone writes a book. It's because it's really hard. But it's also a mind game. You have to really change your mental models about the stories you tell yourself, about your ideas, and do people care about what you have to say, and getting really disciplined, and the rigor was huge in the process of writing The Creativity Leap. And so was the wonder. And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I interviewed over 50 people who come from a range of sectors. And that part I loved. I loved just generating ideas and collecting stories from people and interweaving them into, now, does this now make sense, or does debunk what I was saying earlier, and putting pieces of a puzzle together. So ultimately, it was an incredible experience. The book has exceeded my expectations. It was awarded 2 Best Business Books of 2020 shortlists, and actually won in the creativity category for one of those. And it just received Fast Company's honorable mention in the creativity category for their World-Changing Ideas Award. So I'm thrilled. It actually is something I continue to plan on doing. I will continue to write.
If you're going to buy one book this year, go to Amazon.com and search for Natalie Nixon's The Creativity Leap. It's truly a guide to navigating business amidst the complexity of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Designed by Dot Show is written and produced by the Design Corps at Aurora 21 Studios. Podcast producer, audio engineer, and original music by Peña-Bickley. Commercial voice talent by Angelo Giannone. And I'm your host,
Joanna Peña-Bickley.